The night the season opened its teeth, Miss Eleanor Ashcombe stood beneath a chandelier bright enough to expose every fault society wished to find. Light spilled over gilt mirrors and silk gowns, over powdered faces practiced in kindness, yet the air trembled with judgment. A murmur followed her entrance, not loud enough to be named unkind, but sharp enough to wound. She was beautiful in the manner approved by mothers and dismissed by fortune hunters. Serene features, a composed mouth, eyes too thoughtful for flirtation. Her curtsy before the Prince Regent was flawless, but perfection itself can invite resentment, and Eleanor felt the subtle shift, the cooling of interest that came once admiration found no dowry to warm it. She had been called the season's perfect lady long before she earned the title, polished by years of discipline, instructed in when to smile, when to lower her gaze, when to speak only if spoken to. Her father's name was respectable, her lineage clean, yet her inheritance amounted to little more than careful manners and a modest settlement that promised comfort, not advantage. Tonight, that truth hovered near her like a shadow only she could see. She accepted gloved hands, endured hollow compliments, and marked her dance card with hopes she had learned to keep small. When one promised partner failed to appear, then another, Eleanor understood the message with a calm that surprised even herself. Across the room, the Duke of Ravenshaw observed the evening as a man watches a battlefield long after the fighting has ended. His title carried weight, but it was the weary gravity of obligation, not triumph. Widowhood had etched restraint into his posture, debt into his thoughts, and the memory of war into the set of his jaw. The Duke was not a figure of romantic rumor. He was discussed instead in ledgers, estates, and quiet negotiations meant to save a family name from collapse. Tonight, he stood among ministers and patrons of the regent, bound by expectation, already half promised to a young woman whose fortune would restore what duty had consumed. He noticed Eleanor without intention, drawn by the stillness she carried amid glittering excess. Where others laughed too brightly, she listened. Where others advanced, she waited. The Duke's gaze lingered an instant longer than prudence advised, long enough for recognition to pass between them like a held breath. She looked away first, not from fear, but from instinct, sensing that attention from such a man was never idle. He inclined his head, a courtesy rendered harmless by distance, yet the moment left a faint unease behind, as if something unspoken had been acknowledged. The room shifted around them, a tide of music and movement. Eleanor overheard her name spoken softly, paired with assessments disguised as concern. Too refined. Too quiet. A pity about the fortune. She smiled through the sting, aware that each whisper was a lesson in survival. Nearby, the Duke heard his own fate discussed with equal frankness, his future measured in alliances rather than inclination. A wealthy heiress was mentioned, her dowry praised as though it were a virtue. He accepted the commentary with practiced indifference, though the weight of it pressed heavily tonight. Circumstance conspired to draw them closer without granting intimacy. They were placed in the same set, obliged to share the polite distance of society's choreography. When they spoke, it was only of weather and music, yet beneath each phrase lay careful restraint. Eleanor noted the steadiness of his voice, the absence of pretense. The Duke observed her composure, the way she answered without flattery, as though she respected conversation more than advantage. Each recognized in the other a refusal to perform, and that refusal felt perilous. As the evening waned, Eleanor's final dance was claimed by a gentleman eager enough to seem kind. She moved through the steps with grace, yet her thoughts strayed to the knowledge that her prospects were narrowing even as the season began. From the edge of the floor, the Duke watched, aware that he should not notice, that he should turn instead toward safer interests. He reminded himself of duty, of necessity, of promises not yet spoken but already binding. Still, when Eleanor passed him at the close of the set, their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away at once. The moment was brief, easily overlooked, yet it settled into Eleanor's thoughts with unsettling persistence. She left the ballroom that night with her reputation intact, and her heart oddly restless, uncertain why the glance of a man she must never consider had disturbed her carefully ordered expectations. In his carriage, the Duke stared out at the darkened streets, troubled by the awareness that he had seen a woman who embodied everything society praised, and everything it would not reward. By morning, London would speak of new alliances and forgotten hopes, but for both Eleanor Ashcombe and the Duke of Ravenshaw, the season had already declared its quiet challenge, and neither could yet guess the cost of refusing it. Eleanor's carriage rolled away beneath a sky blurred by gaslight, and she folded her hands in her lap, reminding herself that restraint was not loss but armor. She had been raised to believe that a woman's worth lay in endurance, that dignity could outlast disappointment if held firmly enough. Yet tonight had unsettled that belief, for she sensed that her composure had been noticed not as an accomplishment, but as an invitation to judgment. Somewhere beyond the glow of the city, she wondered whether perfection was merely another word for loneliness. At Ravenshaw House, the Duke dismissed his servants early, and stood alone in a silent hall lined with portraits of men who had chosen duty over happiness and called it honor. He told himself he was no different, that desire was a weakness history did not forgive. Still, as he extinguished the candles, one thought persisted with unwelcome clarity. The season had only begun, and consequences already waited. The following days unfolded with deceptive calm, as though the season wished to disguise its appetite for consequence beneath polite routine. Eleanor Ashcombe appeared at breakfasts, musicales, and afternoon calls with the same composed grace that had earned her admiration and dismissal in equal measure. Yet she felt the change immediately. Glances lingered longer. Conversations paused when she approached, then resumed with careful brightness. Attention, once withheld, now circled her like a curiosity newly discovered. She understood the cause without being told. The Duke of Ravenshaw had noticed her, and in London, notice itself was a kind of currency. Their next meeting occurred beneath the painted ceiling of an assembly room, where chandeliers burned even in daylight. Eleanor entered with measured steps, resolved to remain unremarkable, yet circumstance proved stubborn. A minor confusion over dance partners left her briefly unclaimed, a familiar humiliation she accepted without flinch. Then, with a deliberation that could not be mistaken for accident, the Duke approached and offered his arm. His voice was low, precise, impossible to refuse without spectacle. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, aware that this single gesture would be observed, remembered, and repeated with embellishment by evening. They danced without speaking at first, the orchestra filling the space where words might have betrayed them. Eleanor noted the steadiness of his hand, the care with which he maintained distance, as though determined to offend neither propriety nor conscience. When he finally spoke, it was only to remark upon the music, yet his tone carried something quieter, an acknowledgment that this moment was not trivial. She replied with equal restraint, choosing her words as one might step across ice. Neither smiled, yet there was ease between them, a sense of shared understanding that unsettled her more than flattery ever could. By the next morning, the Morning Chronicle made its careful observations. Eleanor's name appeared among the polite summaries of attendance, paired with the Duke's in a sentence that praised decorum while inviting speculation. The language was delicate, but its implication was not. Eleanor's mother folded the paper with a sigh that held more fear than reproach. She spoke gently of prudence, of appearances, of how swiftly interest could turn cruel. Eleanor listened with filial patience, though her thoughts remained stubbornly fixed on the knowledge that she had done nothing wrong, and yet risked everything. The Duke faced his own reckonings. A letter awaited him, written in a hand both elegant and expectant, reminding him of obligations yet to be formalized. The heiress's name carried relief with it, a promise of solvency and restored influence. He read the words twice, then set them aside, troubled not by reluctance, but by the intrusion of comparison. Eleanor's face came unbidden to his mind, composed and honest, devoid of calculation. He dismissed the thought as indulgence, yet found it returned with persistent clarity. Their encounters multiplied, modest in isolation, dangerous in accumulation. A shared conversation at the opera, where he ensured she had a clear view of the stage. A book delivered to her family's address, its inscription neutral, its meaning unmistakable. A single white rose left among many at a gathering, anonymous enough to deny, distinctive enough to be recognized. Eleanor accepted these gestures with caution, aware that gratitude itself could be mistaken for encouragement. Still, she kept the book near her bed and pressed the rose between pages she pretended not to reread. Society responded as it always did, with sharpened interest masked as concern. Invitations arrived with new urgency, as though Eleanor's proximity to scandal made her suddenly valuable. Equally swift came warnings, offered with smiles and sympathetic tones. She was advised to guard her reputation, reminded of the Duke's circumstances, of the folly of hoping where outcomes were already decided. Eleanor absorbed these cautions without protest, though privately she questioned the justice of a world that allowed men necessity but denied women desire. When at last the Duke spoke plainly, it was only in part. They stood near a tall window during a crowded evening, rain streaking the glass like restless fingers. He said he regretted the attention his courtesy had brought her, that it had never been his intention to cause difficulty. Eleanor answered with calm honesty, telling him she regretted nothing that had been honorable. Their exchange was brief, yet charged with meaning, each sentence balancing confession and restraint. As they parted, the space between them felt heavier than before. That night, Eleanor lay awake, aware that the season had altered her course without asking consent. She sensed that retreat would cost her peace, yet advance would demand sacrifice. Across the city, the Duke paced his study, confronted by a choice he had hoped to avoid. The tokens he had offered could no longer be dismissed as kindness alone. They had become a language, and silence now would speak louder still. Rain softened the city the evening Eleanor Ashcombe agreed to meet the Duke of Ravenshaw without witnesses, as though London itself wished to hush what history would never record. The garden lay dim beneath dripping branches, its paths empty, its statues blurred by mist, and Eleanor stepped into it with a resolve born not of recklessness but exhaustion. She had reached the limit of careful endurance, the point where silence itself became a kind of falsehood. When the Duke emerged from the shadows, his expression grave and unguarded, she understood that he too had crossed a threshold from which retreat would offer no peace. They stood a measured distance apart, propriety lingering even here, yet the air between them felt charged with words long withheld. The Duke spoke first, his voice low and deliberate, shaped by years of command and restraint. He said that he had asked for this meeting not to plead, nor to promise, but to be honest in a world that rewarded evasion. He confessed that his regard for her had grown beyond courtesy, that he had resisted it as one resists an enemy, and failed. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands clasped tightly, aware that each syllable altered the future she had been taught to accept. He continued, acknowledging the obstacles with painful clarity. His estate teetered on the edge of ruin, his family's expectations pressed upon him, and a marriage of advantage awaited his consent. He told her he could offer no security, no swift resolution, only truth. To pursue her openly would invite scandal, to retreat without explanation would wound her unfairly. He said he would abide by her decision, whatever it might be, though the effort of saying so showed plainly upon his face. When Eleanor answered, her voice carried a steadiness that surprised even herself. She said she had never sought his attention, yet she would not deny its meaning now that it had found her. She spoke of dignity, not as submission, but as choice, and of how she refused to be ashamed of feelings she had not invited but would not disown. She told him she understood the cost of loving a man bound by duty, and that she would not be the instrument of his dishonor. If he asked her to hope without promise, she could not. If he asked her to forget, she would try, though it would leave its mark. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of rain on leaves. The Duke turned away, as though steadying himself against the weight of her words. In that moment, he saw with sudden clarity the life he had been preparing to accept, one shaped by preservation rather than conviction. He had believed sacrifice the highest form of honor, yet standing before Eleanor, he recognized a different courage, one that required action rather than endurance. He returned to face her, his decision settled not with triumph, but with calm resolve. He said he would end the negotiations for his advantageous marriage, that he would confront the ruin he had postponed and accept whatever consequence followed. He would not ask Eleanor to bind herself to uncertainty, yet he would no longer pretend that safety purchased at the cost of truth was honorable. His declaration was quiet, stripped of drama, yet it carried the force of irrevocability. Eleanor felt a sharp intake of breath escape her composure, the first crack in the restraint she had perfected. She told him she did not need vows spoken in gardens, nor assurances forged in defiance. What she needed was time, and the freedom to choose without coercion, whether by society or affection. The Duke inclined his head, accepting her condition with solemn respect. They parted then without touch, without promise sealed, yet with a mutual understanding that neither would again pretend indifference. As Eleanor returned to the house, she felt lighter, though uncertainty still waited ahead. The consequences arrived swiftly, as they always did. Whispers hardened into judgment, invitations cooled, and Eleanor's family braced for censure. The Duke faced harsher trials still, his decision received with disbelief and quiet outrage. Yet through the turbulence, neither sought to undo what had been chosen. Months passed, and with them, the season's fever broke. London turned its gaze to newer scandals, leaving older ones to settle into memory. In time, Ravenshaw's affairs were arranged with painful economy rather than rescue. Eleanor's circumstances altered less visibly, yet she carried herself with a confidence no longer borrowed from approval. When at last the Duke sought her again, it was without secrecy, without apology, and with an offer shaped by humility rather than need. Their union was not celebrated with splendor, but it endured with steadiness, forged in the knowledge of what had been risked and refused. Society remembered the titles and the whispers, but history, had it listened closely, might have heard something rarer still, the quiet sound of two people choosing truth, and finding in it a lasting peace.